Okay, hopefully that uploads. Let me get back to your question. Well, Paul is writing 10 to 15 years after these events, right? And he's talking to the people and walking around and, meeting with James and Peter and John and Silas and Barnabas. The Gospel of Mark, I actually put very early. I mean, I put that before the fall of the temple, and then other scholars actually put that like within 3 years, because you'll see that I believe the term immediately comes up 26 times within the first 2 chapters. Or maybe it's 36. And then you have, he goes here, there's not really much teaching, and then you have this passion narrative that looks like an eyewitness account. And later on we get this guy Papias who says, yeah, because Mark got his information from Peter. And it really does sound like Peter. And then we have Matthew, which is a Judaized version of Mark, and then Luke comes along and says this is just Jewish supremacist crap. That's and he writes his gospel, and then of course John comes along. Although I believe John is actually earlier than Matthew or Luke because of the fact that it does not have a virgin birth. Many times it calls Jesus a Samaritan. There's certain things where it doesn't show as developed as Matthew or Luke, or it doesn't even seem aware of their controversies. Even though people say, well, it's got such high theological stuff. Yeah, within a few years, that can pop up, and especially if it's a very Hellenized piece of writing, which it is, it's going to sound like that. And, the Greeks were very eloquent people. The skepticism I would place would be on things like First and Second Peter, Jude, the Apocalypse of John. I think is early. James, I never thought was written by James until recently. The pastoral epistles are obviously either Paul in his old age, because when I first read the pastoral epistle, I'm like, this isn't Paul, or this is Paul after a long time mellowing out, because it just didn't sound like him at all. But yeah, I mean, we have Clement writing in AD 98, and he's quoting from the Gospels, right? And we have stuff inside the first century, like the Epistle of Barnabas and stuff like that, that quote this stuff. I mean, even Jude winds up talking about the works of Paul. But something like Second Peter and Jude, actually First Peter, was not anti-legomena, but it was close. Second, Third John were definitely anti-legomena. You have to look at what is homolegomena and anti-legomena, because the stuff, some things that made it into the New Testament are anti-legomena. Certainly James and Hebrews, definitely. And where the hell did that come from? That wasn't written by Paul. It's not even grouped with the Pauline works. It really goes into a lot of discussion in textual criticism, particularly the likes of D.C. Parker et al., which is to what extent are we recovering original authorial texts? What extent are we recovering the earliest authoritative or canonical text? Is there a meaningful difference, and how do we know? Well, when the variants are scribal errors, or when somebody's copying um, Mark, right, and they're so used to reading, since Mark and Luke and Matthew are so similar in many things, they might actually write out how it was in Luke, and that we can see the branches. It's almost like DNA or genetics, hereditary, because these things got copied down literally religiously. So when we go back, we can see where these copyist errors began. That's why the Alexandrian manuscript line is trusted a lot more, because it's earlier and it was before the centralization around around Constantinople, the Byzantine texts. Um, the and the texts, I mean, I would say the Didache is authoritative, definitely, and Epistle of Barnabas. But remember, the texts are not the authoritative thing. It's the church and those who write them. So even if Second Peter is spurious or First Peter is spurious, teachings aren't. And remember, back then, if you were a disciple of Paul, if you were a student, or if you were a student of Peter, and you got all your teachings from him about Christ, and you wrote an encyclical, if you put your name on it, that's forgery. You would put Peter's name on it, because that's all the teaching, that's his teaching, right? The same thing that they did with philosophers. Like if you were taught by Plato, right, and you wrote a work that had all of Plato's ideas and everything that you learned from him, you wouldn't put your name on it. That would be considered a forgery. You'd put Plato's name on it. It really goes to a lot of discussions of textual criticism. Oh, okay, we went through this. 10. Well, I wish your tone at this point was a little less dismissive. I appreciate you feel frustrated for whatever reason. I know the feeling, but let's both look at detail of what guys who wrote about. I'm not interested in rhetorical jousting. I think we're doing fine. But instead of actually looking and speaking accurately and clearly at these topics, I would actually love to speak with you by hang out. Let me see how many minutes I have left on this video. Okay, I have some. We need to distinguish carefully between day creationism. Creationism is created in the form of an actual 24-hour day age creationism, young earth creationism. Did Origin, etc., believe that God created the universe in literal day stages? No. You're absolutely correct there. Did Origin believe the earth was millions of years old? No. In fact, he writes explicitly, citing Moses as his source. The earth is well under 10,000 years old. It's the argument in his arguments against Celsus. We have to also consider that Origin was a heretic who castrated himself and believed in reincarnation. But the Genesis is not a textbook of science book. Then it has it has 7 creation accounts, but it has 2 creation accounts right off the bat. If you look at the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria, when he's mocking the overly mysticist people who were into astrology that were Christian, as well as the hyper-literalists, he goes, imagine if somebody were to take the first parts of Genesis literally, and he goes through. He almost sounds like a modern Thunderfoot when he said like, how could you have light before this? Or, it's out of whack. Now, I like people like Hugh Ross. I think Hugh Ross and Michael Heiser, I think they do a good job, but I don't really buy their scientific explanations for things like this. But again, that doesn't. I don't see that as affecting theology at all. That the Earth was well under 10,000 years old, who held that rather the Greek idea, time future of the universe was eternal. He was an allegorist, but context only specifically regards the days of Genesis, not in regards to the Earth, on which the basis he would probably be called a literalist by many on today's standards. Yeah, there's a trick with the literalists. The funny thing is that if you look at it, you say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and without void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was moving or hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And how long did that take? We don't know. And day, the idea of it being a 24-hour period is just silly. There's plenty of time in that day. I mean, even we use the expression. In the day that George Bush was in office, he was in office for 8 years. In the days and the nights of shining armor, it's epoch or aeon. Somebody wants to believe it's 6 literal 24-hour periods. Again, this was also addressed of how can you have a 24-hour period if you don't have the sun? I mean, the ancients knew that they measured time by the sun and the moon. So I don't think the sun and the moon appear until like the 4th day. I believe this was made clear in the Stromata by Clement of Alexandria. It could have been Basil the Great that did that. Clement stated the universe was created in an instant, in a single thought. I agree. Both what would be considered old Earth and young Earth position, but specifically stated the universe was some 5,500 years old, calculating the literal atom to the death of Commodus, contemporary Roman, early 2nd century. Yeah, okay. Basil, Caesarea, Ephraim, Lactantius, and others were all explicit about 24-hour days. I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm glad that you know these guys, though. That's very that fills my heart with joy that you know these guys. Let me see how I'm doing on time, so I don't go over. Okay, good. Likewise, neither would support a typical old Earth position today. This really is a side issue because I honestly think old or young Earth belief is neither here nor there for some Christian belief per se, but seeing as you were pretty dismissive in your response, I wanted to clear the air a little bit. So if the New Testament never existed, if none of the books were ever written, we would have the exact same Christian faith today as we do now. How would you learn about Jesus in that case? Would we be replying to people verbally, telling the gospel over the time period from then to now? Would people be receiving the gospel through other means? If I was dismissive to you, please forgive me. I didn't mean to come across like that. No. The liturgy. The entirety of the text of the Bible is intoned in the liturgy. In fact, I think the the translation of the Bible, and especially the heretical Latin West, the Vatican II, taking the Mass and turning it into the language of the laity instead of keeping it in Latin, is extremely damaging, and that the spread of anybody being able to publish a Bible gave rise to many fanatical cults, and it's very dangerous. I'll do a separate video about that, what I think Christianity would look like, and go into more about what I meant. Again, thank you very much for these questions. Peace to you.